Okay, so we'll start our last session, session 5, on methods and decision-making for investments to deal with disruptions. Leaving me and Eric to try to solve all the massive problems that have been brought up. So I will be talking today about methods or analytical tools that we might be able to use. And you'll see that I'm going to talk about a bunch of different things across modes. And when I cross the modes, I'm going to talk about why they're different, how they're different. I'm not sure that I'll address all of the things we talked about, but I'll try to address some of the things that came up. Okay, let's see. I wanted to hide this. Okay. I just tested this and it was working, and now it's not working. What happened? Oh, it's just very slow. Okay, so my team and I have been working in this area since about 2005. That I mentioned yesterday, and we've tackled developing tools for a lot of different situations. I'm not going to be talking about all of these, but I will be taking some highlights from different areas just to give you a sort of flavor for different things and how these things change. We did not spend a ton of time talking about hazards. I'll just say very much like we talked about yesterday, and I'm not sure how this relates to polycrisis, because I think polycrisis isn't a term I heard until yesterday, maybe more of a compound hazard. But I take a multi-hazard approach in everything I do. It was mentioned yesterday that we have to consider multiple hazards. I think about that because you may take an action for one hazard and it could actually be detrimental to the situation under another hazard. For example, after 9/11, one of the hospitals in the New York City area moved their generators into the basement for security reasons, and then they had flooding from Hurricane Sandy and they couldn't start the generators, and they had to actually evacuate the hospital, which no one plans for. So taking a multi-hazard approach for me is very, very important, and I do that in everything we do. So you'll see that in the models. There's been many definitions of resilience, but they all come down to the same two things. In my mind, the way I look at it is the inherent coping capacity and the adaptability. I think earlier today, someone brought up resistance versus transformation, and we talked about resilience for these two different things. I actually think they have to both be there. Otherwise, we're not talking about resilience. So we need to think about that, building up that resistance, preparing for, training for, getting ready to take the actions later so that we can be adaptive, and then the adaptations themselves. So you'll see this also in the models. That's how the models are structured around this concept. I also think of this from an action framework perspective. So on the left side, you'll see things that you do before the event. First, there's the natural coping capacity of your system, how you built it, how we structured it, the things we were talking about, that we built it in a certain way, and it's going to have certain redundancies already. We then can take actions to make it more resistive, like hardening actions, so that it diminishes the impacts of some kind of event, and then increasing redundancy or capacity to give us more buffer. Those are all pre-event actions. We also need to prepare for the post-event actions that we'll take, and adaptations we'll take in our response phase. And so we can also pre-position resources or train people, or purchase things. I like to think about purchasing a fire extinguisher that sits and doesn't do anything unless you need it, so it has no utility. So I like to use that action framework in the back of my mind as I think about how to develop these tools. The first tool we built quite a while ago, maybe in about 2007 or 8, we were just trying to capture this mathematically, and we didn't know how to do that. And at the time, the mathematical models did not have the adaptation in them. They were basically like reliability kinds of things. You take a link out, you test the network, and you see, okay, how did it fail, or how did it perform after this failure, and things like that. So we tried to build that into the model, and we ended up with this stochastic optimization problem. I won't go through all the details of it, but I want to show you what they look like and point a couple things out as we go, because you'll see that the structures of them will change as we try to tackle different things. Here, I'll just say that we weren't trying to optimize anything at the time, because we were just trying to measure resilience. We didn't know how to do that. And so we wanted to have both that coping capacity and the adaptability in there. They're in there. You'll see these little C's. There are these values that look like little squiggles. These are our scenarios. So this is where we build the scenarios in, and we have many of them. We could have 10,000 of them. And what else did I want to say? This, at the beginning, we didn't think about preparedness and we didn't think about building up resistance. We only thought your system is what it is, and then you might take some adaptation. So that led to a certain way that we could solve these problems. So also mentioned this morning, I think Jillian said something about first we have to identify the problem and then we need to solve it. I think of it the same way. I'm trying to capture the problem mathematically, be able to conceptualize it, and then I develop the solution techniques for it. My team, I should say, does. The structure that the models take affects how we solve them and how hard they are to solve as well. So that was the first thing. We applied it at first for rail system, the northwest corner, I think, of the US. We were looking at rail. And then we applied it to the Port of St. Lucia. I had a project back ended in 2007 through one of the old programs at the EU with the European Commission. And we had visited the Port of St. Lucia and we had friends there and they gave us data. So we used real information from that port and we applied the concept there. And so we modeled the network of everything that was going on in the ports in a very detailed way. We took 5 different classifications of disasters, from earthquake, flooding, and types of terrorism attacks that were very specific to the port. They had a chemical facility on site. So we thought of a coordinated attack on that, things like this. We generated 10,000 random scenarios based on the structures of these types of hazards. And then we test the system against those 10,000 hazards. And what I like to think about is when we think about something being resilient is that post-event, if you have to do something really big or it costs a ton of money, it's not a resilient system. So we thought if you could take small adaptations, small actions, low-cost actions that can be fast, then we can say, okay, capture that in there. This system is or isn't, is resilient at a certain level. When I talk about measuring resilience, I use continuity of operations as my guiding force. I don't think we need a single measure for anything. I think the measure changes with the system. So I look at hospitals, I care about wait times, or I care about fatalities. If I'm looking at the port, I'm looking at throughput. And I really care about how good am I now that these events are happening, maybe an expectation given all the things that might happen versus how well am I performing today. And you can think about that also from a time perspective. These are like opposite sides of the same coin. So if it takes me a long time to recover. So I gave myself a recovery budget of 0, meaning you have no adaptation, to $100,000 of almost $80 million in actions you could take. And what I think is really interesting here is you'll see we measure resilience on the right-hand side. The resilience goes up if you can have some adaptation. On the left-hand side, we took point resilience. Those are 10,000 points on each. And what's interesting is you can see with 0 adaptation, you have in your worst case scenario, 0 throughput in the port. Whereas if I have $100,000, and don't think of it as money, it's really resources. If I have $100,000 worth of resources, I can get 60% throughput of what I would ordinarily get under having had some adaptation in my worst case. And then I can see its average behavior and things like this. This is much more recent. This is from the Port of Singapore. I've done work with the National University of Singapore and folks at the Port of Singapore, and actually met with some PSA folks when I was in Singapore just right before COVID. They developed a digital port twin for the new port, and very, very big operation to create this. And I was working with the group that developed the digital port twin. So we used it because I was talking about resilience there. And what we did is we can replace the mathematical models with the digital port twin, and we can get a sense of the complex operational constraints that are going on, and we can even capture ordinary operational uncertainties in the models, and even the recovery process. Even your recovery actions have some uncertainty in how they'll perform. So you can capture that much better than in the mathematical models, but to build this is extremely expensive, has to be maintained, and you can't use it, you have to use it way in advance. So this is, but the idea is to have it roll. And they wanted us to use birth on arrival. So I thought that might be interesting for some of the folks in the room. In terms of how do we measure how good this system is, and we looked at different power outages situations for their scenarios. And then we had recovery actions that had to do with how do you allocate that power to the key cranes and the automated guided vehicles. So turning back now, after we had developed that first work, I thought about it as having a resilience toolbox. So the adaptations you can have come from a toolbox, that $80 million worth of different actions you could take. They could involve training. They can involve placing something at the ready. We looked at different ways that maybe the stevedoring companies might operate together or like collaborate together. If I lose this, you'll loan me this piece of equipment, or that sort of thing. And so I think building that resilience toolbox and that adaptation toolbox, just coming up with it, planning for it, is a huge part of what you need to do. So that same model you saw at the beginning, I don't know what just happened to this. It kind of takes over my screen. 1 second. That model that you saw, when I start thinking about, well, how do I prepare for those adaptation strategies I want to put in place? I can't use the fire extinguisher unless I bought one and put it in my kitchen, right? So I want to have it at the ready. I also maybe want to improve my situation, add more coping capacity, and so on. So I can change that model. Sorry, I have a lot of animation and it's very, very slow, so I'm not sure what it's going to do. And what you'll see, hopefully in a moment, is I'm going to circle some of the items that are in here. Let's see if it's going. Okay, while it's doing that. So there are different items that changed in that mathematical model that will be circled in a moment when it catches up. And what you'll see is if I take adaptation measures right now, I can improve my adaptations later. I can make them cheaper. If I have an extinguisher, it makes it really cheap to try to put that fire out than if I don't have that extinguisher. And I can make them faster. So that gets captured in the model as well. And now I have the option when I think about, okay, how resilient is my system? Given that, I have choices now. And I have, again, a small pot of money, but I want to use it either in preparedness or in response. And this will then tell me where to put my money. Should I do it before? Should I do it after? I don't know why it's stuck. I mean, I'm going to hit it a few times, but oh, this is very strange. Okay, let me go on without that. I don't know when the slide's going to catch up. What's up? Well, if you share it, though, I lose all the animation, and then things are just written on top of each other. I don't know what happened here that it's not moving. Okay, let's see. Let me stop sharing and reshare. And hopefully this will work okay. Here we go. Okay, maybe hiding the controls made me end the controls. Okay, so you see, by changing this, I just changed a few things. It changes, though, the entire structure of the model. And now I have different mathematical tools that I need to use to solve this problem. We take that exact same formulation that you saw. Now I'm applying it for an airport, for runways and taxiways. And I had to build in all kinds of other constraints to capture the situation. So I'm capturing the directions we use the runways in, the visibility and how that affects the situation on the ground, but also how it affects my ability to take actions after, how fast something cures, and so on. It also affects what kinds of hazards can happen. So you can't have a heat event in the middle of winter or a snow event in the middle of the summer. Things like this. Taxiways, if my aircraft are moving the same direction, I'll have more throughput than if they're against each other. All of that is captured mathematically. Also captured in here are having equipment at the ready. You have teams who you train at the ready versus going to outside sources when something happens and asking them to come in and respond. We built this into a decision support tool with this optimization core with a scenario generator and a meteorological condition generator. We looked at extreme climatic events, operational events, intentional malicious acts, and all the ways that they can harm the pavements. And we looked at the types of actions you would have to take and what kind of equipment you have to take and all the costs. And these are very, very detailed. And we had weather-dependent indicators like this takes longer if the weather is certain temperature, that sort of thing. When you're done, we can create a lot of different output. Some of them include resilience and difference curves. What if I have more time? I find it acceptable to have a little more time or a little less time. Depending on your application, here in looking at aircrafts, you're looking at short term, less than a day. You don't want people sitting on an aircraft for many, many, many hours or days. Whereas goods that are moving on a rail maybe could sit on the side track, and maybe you could be 2 weeks late and it would be acceptable for the certain, the conditions you're under. Also, you can break out the results in terms of how bad or good this is under different hazard types, and whether or not it's, if you turn on and off preparedness or response, how does that, how resilient is the system if you can't adapt, or if you don't have preparedness actions, you can turn those variables on and off. All kinds of other things can come out of this that have to do with the operations, like which configuration of the runways is most important to keep it resilient and things like that. So now I started thinking about people. And now we're moving people on roadways. And this comes back to yesterday's discussion with Amy and Dirk about this ability to self-organize. I hadn't thought of it exactly that way, but now I start moving to bi-level programs. And here's where I think these are the most powerful. You're going to see we're going to use them more and more. Harder to solve, but they are really powerful because they get at both these sides of it. At the upper level of this mathematical decision problem, you can have stochastic optimization. So you have things rolling, we don't know, we learn things over time and we react to them and we recover from them. All of that is at the upper level. But what's at the upper level are the leaders. Those are the people who make decisions, how much to invest and what to invest in. Should I train people? All those kinds of things are at the top level. Regulations can be put in there, incentives can be pulled into there. But at the lower level is the response of the users. This is where we actually don't control, they're not cargo and they're not aircraft that we can control. They're individuals who are using the roadways and we can't make them do what we want them to do. So we're going to let them have their freedom to do what they want to do, but we want to incentivize them, coerce them into certain behaviors. So we capture that through the actions we take, through the incentives or whatever it is, the investments we make at the upper level. And then we make those decisions given what their response might be. So we don't, they're not separate, they're integrated. And what we say the solution is obtained at what we call a Stackelberg equilibrium between these two. Here I'm also showing you that we have the whole disaster phases incorporated into upper level. We looked at interdependence between systems. At the time we were looking at this, we didn't have models out there with transportation being interdependent with anything. So this was the first time we were trying this. There was no literature on this. So we just picked a roadway with traffic lights and tried to look at the integration of these two things. So we're looking at power distribution. And here's a little portion of a roadway network. Here's the roadway part. Here's our we have some substation map with the power feeders. And we show that we can integrate these two networks together. And we, again, use this bi-level approach where we're able to take actions at the upper level, either preparedness or like we put solar energy at the traffic lights as backup, or we have something at the ready. Power generation, we purchase it. And then in the recovery response phase, we will maybe put people at the intersections to guide the traffic, or we'll take some other action, right? So all of that is in the upper level, and the bottom level, again, is the traffic. Here, resilience is in terms of delays. Where we were looking at the airport, it was in terms of takeoffs and landings of small and large aircraft. So here we care about travel delay for the passenger, the people who are using the system. So we would measure that way. So we were thinking, okay, so let's take this. I have my transportation hat on, and then I started integrating the power network, and I started thinking, oh, whose resilience is it? Is it the power systems, or is it the transportation systems? And when we take all our actions for one, we might actually not help the other, but yet we want society to come back. So I'll come back to that in a little bit. Now, earlier, Jillian talked about socio-technical systems, and that's what I want to share now. So all along, we've been working on these and other models, and I was really thinking about the engineered system, the technical system. And I wanted to actually flip it and ask about the user. So here, what we did was we said, let's look at the resilience of the users of the transit system, not the resilience of the transit system itself. So if we do that, we have different users with different adaptation abilities. Like some people are mobility challenged, maybe other people might be really savvy with ride-hailing apps. And we're thinking about social capital and how that played a role in your ability to adapt when something goes wrong with the transit system and how much it mattered for you and so on. So in doing that, by flipping this question to ask it from the user perspective, a number of things happen. First of all, we recognize there's different users with different levels of service. On their ordinary days, the services may not be as good for some users as it is for others. And then you can't separate them. You can't look at the system from one user's perspective or the others. You have to have them together because they share the capacity of the system, particularly when there's a shock to the system. That capacity really matters. So another thing is we have induced coupling of technical systems because we are looking at the users of the system. The users in their adaptations will rely on communications networks, and they'll flood the communication network possibly. So there's interdependencies with those systems. We would not have thought about that if we only looked at this from the engineered perspective. So in this case, we also have different baselines, and so that we might use for understanding resilience. And we used a very different approach that was based on a multi-valued decision diagram approach, more like a reliability approach. I also looked at the service, so transportation as a portion of larger services that we provide to society. So here we're looking at buildings. The buildings are connected by communications networks and by transportation links. And the buildings only serve the societal function if they are served by the lifelines. And so in this case, we looked at healthcare, and we have the buildings cannot operate if they don't have power, if they don't have water, water with a certain level of pressure, and so on. And so we're looking now at the resilience of a system, a societal system that's dependent on interdependent lifelines that themselves are subject to their own shocks. And then how do we build those together? And so we looked at this mathematically. We tried the healthcare at the top, and then we have WET, the water, energy, transportation trilogy underneath. And again, looking at these interdependencies. And now our model, again, is stochastic optimization, where we also we've developed very, very sophisticated models with the help of Johns Hopkins of the hospital systems, of the emergency hospitals. And we were able to then develop a meta model for the functioning of the hospital that we built into our mathematical model. So we became a simulation optimization. And again, looking at the disaster over time, but this time a little differently. Here we have the disaster, but pre-disaster, but then we have post-disaster, many different periods, because immediately after the disaster, you have generators, you have some water supply at the, that you've saved, you put into place, and then you run out. And when you run out, things change. So that's captured in there. Again, different kinds of things we can do that are in the decision model. Should we have on-site power generation? Should we have two lines going in the electric system, the power system, to the hospitals to have some redundancy and so on? Back to ports again. I seem to always come back to ports in my life. So here I was visiting Singapore, and the very first time I was talking with the folks at the port agency there, the Port of Singapore. They were saying, well, we can build, they're building this new port. And they said, we can build it as resilient as we want it. The only thing they worried about was cybersecurity. And I started thinking, well, that's great. Singapore could be the most resilient port in the world. However, it's part of a larger system. And if other ports on the lines that go through Singapore have problems, it's going to affect Singapore. So I wanted to share that. So I think everyone in transportation knows how things trickle through. And so I'll move through that quickly. But basically, to model that, I had this idea that ports might actually do well to not just invest in themselves, but to invest in other ports that are in their line. And they might themselves get a larger share of the market if they are in a resilient corridor kind of thing. So there'd be agreements, for example, in Virginia, they were talking about having an agreement with Georgia in case there's a storm coming to the East Coast, they can back each other up. And if you make it more reliable, then you'll have more customers, is what they were thinking. So we captured that. And the idea now is each port has a bi-level program. top level, they're making these decisions about investments. And at the lower, and again, with the rolling stochastic kind of optimization where we get to take actions after the thing happens as well as before. And the lower level is the line of shipping problem. It's the market. And they don't have their own market. They share that market. So they're tied together. They're competing, but with a shared market. And I'm suggesting something called co-opetition. So it's like they're competition, but if they collaborate a little, they can actually do better for themselves. And so we looked at developing a model of this. It's a stochastic, what we call equilibrium problem with equilibrium constraints. And I'll pass through the solution approach, but very different from the other ones you saw. Okay, so now at the lower level of that problem is the liner shipping problem or market clearing problem. And that means nobody's investing anywhere. So that's just the market is moving as it does. Now I can model this as what we call a restricted game and then that means all the investments are made in themselves, which is what we've been assuming. Now, I don't know with PSA having locations in many places, maybe this may even be a way to model something like that. In an unrestricted game, everyone can invest anywhere. In a semi-restricted game, only a portion of the ports will play and some will not play. And then we have a system perspective. The only thing at the time that had been in the literature, in the academic literature, was, oh, there's this nice pot of money and we'll share it. And we'll do what's best for the overall system, not for any one port. So some ports will do worse than others. And yeah. And then we looked at coalitions. What about if you invest in each other, if you're in a coalition? And we were able to show the benefits and the possible monetary gains of these kinds of different situations. But doing this made me ask, whose resilience are we talking about? And I think this came up earlier as well. Is it the system's resilience? So total OD, the origin destination demand served would be a goal for us. Is it the ports? Well, the ports want a lot of throughput, which means they want lots of transshipments activities. They want all kinds of extra activity, right? So it's profit driven. Or is it the shippers who, again, are worried about the costs? And so there's many different ways we can look at that. Just a small study that we just did, we were looking at workforce shortages and absenteeism in the ports. And so we came up with another model, and we wanted to look at how does a shortage in one region affect other regions? How does, can we absorb, what level can we absorb of a shortage in workers at the ports? And again, thinking about alliance strategies to reduce risk exposure. Kind of different from all this, we came back to this idea of recovery. So now that you have this shock, we have here in this network hospitals, we have power, water, all different elements of these. So you see all the elements listed. And we developed a real-time model for making recovery decisions with the idea, first we did it with just bringing back the lifelines for a community. Then we said, let's put the critical services at the top and make the lifelines underneath. So transportation now is underneath. And if we prioritize the hospitals, and we're making these real-time decisions, how much faster can we bring up these services? And then does it affect the long-term ability to bring up the whole community? Can we just move them up a little, give them a little more priority, and have the overall recovery be just as good? And so we showed some things related to that. And I bring this up because then I started thinking, well, what does this have to do with resilience? And what I realized was we can measure the resilience of the hospitals by not looking at the real-time aspect. Don't take any actions yet, and just ask, given all the scenarios that might be happening, because it's scenario-based again, what is my capability in expectation right at this moment? And I can actually use the mathematical model in a one-shot approach and get that answer. So there's this connection between a recovery decision-making and the ability to measure resilience that I hadn't really thought of before. So this shows, how we could capture that and how we can capture hospital resilience and, and how much you can improve different pieces of the element, how much of the system, given the different approach that we're trying to take. What I think is also interesting from a transportation perspective is we can see how much faster the routes to the hospitals come up to support the critical services. And so you can actually see them getting prioritized. So very, very recently, we're just about to submit this. I've been thinking about the human part in all of this. So we always think about the human part from innovation, adaptation, who came up with the ideas at the last minute when things were happening. I think William talked about this, or maybe Marco talked about this need for smart. I think Marco talked about the need for the educators to make our people smart and agile, right? We weren't modeling the people in the models. We model the crews that go out to repair things, but we weren't modeling the personnel. So we've now tried to embed the personnel in the mathematical models. We ask, do they have functioning lifelines to their own houses? Are they functioning? And we can even ask, do they have daycare? And then we say, do they have pathways to access the hospitals or fueling stations or any critical facility? And can they get to their work? And we then have levels of functionality for those critical services that we say, okay, we might be willing to accept 50% serviceability. We have 50% of our doctors and our nurses and our technicians at the hospitals. That's good enough in this emergency to get rolling. Or we can ask, oh, we need 75% or so on. And they're living in different communities, and we can look at how strategies for where they live. We can look at strategies for what if we use transit to move them because we're having trouble with the car? So we commandeer transit systems, things like this. You can build all of those things in. So we've done that. We've shown how to mathematically integrate humans as infrastructure, which I think is a really cool concept. I'm very excited about that. And we can also look at resilience now. And the other thing I want to say about this is why I think this is so important is if we don't account for the personnel, which I think we didn't do in the supply chains, we only account for the technical systems again, we think that we're going to be back up and running by a certain time. And then, but we don't have the people. A little bit like we go on the aircraft and then the pilot and the crew have to leave and you go, okay, well, my plane is useless without them. Same thing here. So by actually putting them into the models, you'll change your decisions about what comes next. Getting them power back to their homes may have to come before other people so that we can get them into the hospitals, for example, or the fueling stations. We've talked about sudden shock and this other question of long-term, short-term, long-term. Everything I've talked about so far has been a short-term kind of thing. Something big happens. We're preparing for lots of big things that might happen, but they're all short-term. I've also done a lot of work in greenhouse gas emissions. I haven't thought about how they integrate too much, but today is making me think. But I have thought about climate change and the slower process and longer decisions and investments. So they're different. You have multi-temporal setting. You have things that are happening every single day. On a daily basis, we have nuisances. I can't get on that roadway, it's closed because I have a flood. But I also have to take decisions at decadal levels. They're huge investments and they're very expensive. So I have to capture the costs of all these things in one model. And I have to decide, well, when do you take these actions? So again, using this bi-level structure, we have the governments taking decisions about the investments they're going to make in the infrastructure and at what points in time to make them, what actions to take, seawalls, for example, putting in seawalls or raising something or putting in better drainage, things like this to try to protect the transportation system. And at the lower level, we have we used in this particular case, the traffic. So the traffic has costs of the nuisance every day. So we did this like 10 years ago. So this has been a while since we did this. There's a lot of discussion. A lot of things have changed in our way of thinking about this since then. But we use this bi-level model approach again. We applied it to the Washington, D.C. area around the Potomac River, which is a major river next to the Smithsonian, the White House, all that is over there. And we used 3 trajectories for sea level rise that now seem obsolete, but at the time, those were the best predictions. We had the 5th, 50th, and 95th percentile projections. We used tools to develop the flood exceedance probabilities and things like this. And we were able to show that, for example, you can get a 54% reduction in added costs due to implementation of protective investments. And we looked at the stochasticity. How important is it to think about uncertainty in the future? What if we plan for the wrong trajectory? What if we, plan for the 95th percentile and it doesn't happen, or the 5th percentile? And how bad does the things work like that? We actually were able to get what's called the expected value of perfect information, which is a stochastic optimization idea. We could use that to show the effectiveness gained by having better predictions. So I think that's really neat to show that mathematically. I want to share one other thought about this. We have work that we're just wrapping up now on greenhouse gas emissions, and something Yoshito said earlier about maintenance and so on. We're looking at, if you take no action, then you have you have to recover from it, all the things that happen. And so you'll have roadways with damage and so on, and you'll have traffic that will have to go around these things. And so we are now in our model, is a separate thing, counting for the greenhouse gases that are you get from having to deal with the effects of climate change on the roadway system when you don't take other actions except for repairs. And then we count the greenhouse gases from the repairs themselves, from the materials in there, the use of equipment, that sort of thing, versus adaptations. The adaptations themselves also have costs. They have greenhouse gas costs. And you have to go around them, they have reduced capacity during the time that they're being built. And we actually capture that in the model as well. And then we find this point where you say the adaptation starts to pay off. We found in our little example about 4 years before it could start paying off. So I thought that was, maybe there's some way to start building that in our resilience thinking, because we weren't thinking about resilience, just it was a separate study. Right now, we're working on a real options approach to this infrastructure protection investment timing problem. So here I had this idea of this using this optimal stopping problem, which comes from the stock markets. So when do you sell your stock, right? But once you sell it, you sold it. It's irreversible. Or should I keep hedging against uncertainty and keep it going, right? Same thing here. We're doing exactly that. When do we take these big, massive decisions? How do we decide now is the time? And you're hedging against uncertainty, the forecasts are changing, and I'm going to learn as I go versus I'm going to take that decision today, I'm going to make that big investment. And so we're actually working on that right now. So these tools are examples of some of the things we've developed that provide ways of actually quantifying some of these things, and actually by accident at the beginning give you actions you can take that we'll call resilience and enhancement actions. And a lot of people have been involved over the years. We have a lot of different papers, and I thank you very much.